They stood trembling in the snow, dressed in thin summer uniforms, waiting for the end. That was the rumor that had followed them all the way to America, that they would be brought here to die. The date was December 1943. The location, Barron, Wisconsin. A steam train ground to a halt in this small frozen town, carrying a cargo of 200 German prisoners of war. These men had been freshly captured from the scorching battlefields of North Africa. They had spent months baking in the desert heat, only to step off the train into temperatures of 15 degrees below zero. Klaus was only 21 years old. He had never witnessed snow like this. In Germany, winter was certainly cold, but this was an entirely different beast. The wind did not merely blow, it sliced through the body like a blade. Within minutes of exposure, his fingers lost all sensation, and his ears felt as though they were burning. Beside him, another prisoner named Werner collapsed directly onto the platform, his body simply giving way to the shock of the cold, falling limp into the deep drift. The American guards hurriedly ushered them into waiting transport trucks. The prisoners had no coats, no gloves, nothing but the lightweight fabric designed for the African sun. Klaus glanced at Werner, whose lips had already turned a shade of blue, and a dark thought took hold. They brought us here to freeze. This is the method of execution. The sentiment was whispered among the other men as well. America had no need to waste bullets on them. The winter would do the work quietly and efficiently. By the time spring arrived, they would all be dead. However, they had no concept of what lay ahead. In that small Wisconsin town, a situation was unfolding that no one, not even the military guards, had anticipated. The local residents had watched the prisoners arrive, and they had made a collective decision. The POW camp itself was Spartan, wooden barracks with dangerously thin walls and small stoves that barely generated heat. That first night, Klaus did not sleep. He lay awake shivering, listening to the sound of grown men weeping from the pain of the cold. Werner, the man who had collapsed, was already in the camp infirmary, with frostbite on 3 fingers. The doctor warned that amputation might be necessary. Morning broke over the frozen landscape. The guards distributed the work assignments. The prisoners were tasked with logging in the dense forests. Klaus stared at the heavy axes, and then at his own frozen, stiff hands. How were they expected to function in these conditions? It was then that the first vehicle arrived. It was not a military transport, but an old Ford pickup truck. Behind the wheel sat a man in his 60s, clad in a heavy wool coat. His name was Earl Hoffman, a local farmer. In the bed of Earl's truck lay bundles of clothing, heavy coats, thick wool socks, gloves, and hats. The guards were baffled by the sight. "Sir, you cannot simply provide supplies to enemy prisoners," one guard protested. Earl stared the man down and replied plainly, "They are working in my woods, aren't they? They can't cut timber if their fingers fall off." He was not asking for permission. Klaus watched in disbelief as Earl began distributing the gear, real civilian clothing, not military issue. When he reached Klaus, he handed him the thickest coat in the pile. "You're a skinny one," the farmer noted. This act of kindness was merely the catalyst for something no one could have predicted. Over the following week, more locals appeared at the camp. A woman named Margaret arrived with handmade wool scarves. The local Lutheran church delivered crates filled with winter boots. The owner of the general store dropped off boxes of hand warmers. The guards remained perplexed. "Why are you helping enemy soldiers?" a guard asked Margaret. She adjusted her glasses and answered with quiet conviction. "Because freezing to death isn't a punishment, it's cruelty. And we are not cruel people." Klaus began to realize a fundamental truth. These Americans were not trying to kill them. But the question remained, Why were they trying to save them? Then came the lesson that would change everything. A local trapper named Jim Redcloud, a Native American from the nearby reservation, approached the camp. He asked the camp commandant if he could teach the prisoners a few things. Overwhelmed by the weather and grateful for any assistance, the commandant agreed. Jim gathered the prisoners in a clearing. He did not speak German, and they spoke very little English, yet he taught them nonetheless. He demonstrated how to layer clothing properly to trap heat. He showed them how to recognize the early signs of frostbite before the damage became irreversible. He taught them how to build a fire that would actually sustain warmth, and how to walk through deep snow without exhausting their energy reserves. Klaus watched this Native American man instruct them in survival techniques that his ancestors had utilized for thousands of years to endure this exact land, this exact winter. And here he was, sharing that wisdom with the enemy. One day, speaking through a translator, Klaus finally asked, "Why help us?" Jim looked at him for a long moment before replying, "Because winter doesn't care what flag you fight for, and neither do I." By January, the death rate at the Barron camp was 0, while other POW camps across America were reporting casualties from frostbite and exposure. Barron had none. The prisoners were working. They were healthy, and they were alive. Werner retained all of his fingers. Margaret's scarves became legendary items among the men. Earl continued to visit every week, always bringing something new: walking sticks, extra firewood, and once, even a harmonica, because he believed men needed music to survive the winter. Klaus learned to split wood exactly the way Jim had shown him. He learned to read the sky, to predict incoming storms. He came to understand that survival was not about toughness, it was about knowledge. These strangers were gifting him the knowledge that would keep him breathing. Then, one morning in February, a blizzard struck. It was the worst storm the region had seen in 20 years. The guards locked down the camp completely. There was no work to be done, only the work of survival. Klaus and the others huddled around the stoves, utilizing every technique Jim had taught them. They layered their clothes, focused on staying dry, and kept moving just enough to maintain circulation. When the storm finally cleared 3 days later, Earl's truck was the very first thing they saw. He had driven through the aftermath of the blizzard to bring extra food. "Figured you boys might be hungry," he said casually, as if it were nothing, as if he hadn't just risked his life for enemy prisoners. The war ended in 1945, and the prisoners were sent home. Klaus returned to a destroyed Germany, but he returned alive. After the war, 73 men from that specific camp sent letters back to Barron, thanking Earl, thanking Margaret, and thanking Jim. Some even returned years later to visit. Klaus himself came back in 1962. Earl was still alive. Older, certainly, but still strong. They sat in his kitchen drinking coffee. Klaus's English had improved significantly by then. "You saved my life," Klaus told him. Earl simply shook his head. "Winter would have killed you. I just showed you how to live through it." Big difference. But here is what haunts this story. Not every camp did what Barron did. In some places, prisoners did freeze, and they did die, because no one decided to help. The difference between life and death was merely a choice made by ordinary people who decided that basic humanity does not stop at enemy lines. Jim Redcloud died in 1978. At his funeral, there was a wreath sent all the way from Germany, signed by 12 former POWs who never forgot the man who taught them to survive. The lesson is simple, yet devastating. Winter does not care about your wars. Suffering does not care about your politics. And sometimes, the enemy isn't the person wearing a different uniform. Sometimes, the enemy is the cold. And the only way to beat it is together.